Hello guys, it's John700 here. Today we're doing another Beyblade discussion. This time another Burst gimmick video. And this is the last one in this sort of sub-series of Burst layer gimmicks. Maybe I'll do something similar for something else, I don't know. But this is the last Burst line and it is DB plus BU as well. Same system, so we're just doing both. But anyways, let's go ahead and get into the actual video itself. First up here we have Dynamite Belial. Now before getting into the actual Bay, I should probably go into the system itself. The DB system has two ways to actually put it together, with high mode and low mode. So for high mode, you take your core, and then you put the blade on top of the core, and then you also take your armor, which will go on top of everything else. So that snaps into place like that, put those like that, and there we have it. This is high mode. So high mode basically is the compatibility mode. You have a higher center of gravity. Generally not really ideal, but you can put older discs before DB discs, and I guess that's cool, but generally DB discs are better, and with DB discs you have kind of an awkward gap with these. It's not a great mode, again, in my opinion, more of a compatibility thing, but the better way to do it, of course, is going to be low mode, where you take blade, put it underneath the core, and then of course the armor will also go beneath everything like this. Now we have the blade in low mode. So now it is locked to only using DB discs, but generally they're the best discs, so whatever. And you now have a lower center of gravity, and I guess referencing to Beyblade X, as we know, you definitely do want a lower center of gravity, as with CX having a higher center of gravity, it's not good. So considering that DB discs are generally better and also you have a better center of gravity here, yeah, this is going to be the ideal mode for DB. So with that said, let's go ahead and actually start getting into Dynamite Belial itself. So Dynamite Belial's lair actually has no gimmicks. Nothing to speak of here. It's also worth noting that Dynamite did have a sort of retool release of it with Devil, but it's effectively the same exact thing. However, Belial's real gimmick comes with gears. Now, as I am only covering the layers, this isn't going to be every single gear, but we do have two related to the layer, F gear and L gear. So F gear actually does kind of round the layer a bit, which is odd for an attack type, but sure I guess. But it also adds some rubber contact points, which is pretty cool. L gear locks Dynamite Belial into high mode, but does give it extra weight and an armor that sort of just pairs very well with it, having more unique weight distribution, so you do get something with these gears, which is pretty cool, but the base bit itself didn't have any real gimmicks, so certainly an interesting way to go about this one. It's also worth noting that F gear and L gear do work with every single Belial blade, Dynamite, Devil, Dangerous, and Divine, but they were first seen, of course, with Dynamite Belial. Moving on to Cyclone Ragnarok. Cyclone Ragnarok is a lot easier to explain, as the only real gimmick is on the Cyclone blade with the stamina wings, which they just kind of move a bit. That's really all there is to it. They're kind of on a bolt with an extra part that sort of locks them from moving too far, which works and helps with airflow, I guess. Maybe a bit for stamina. Nothing crazy, but again, just a nice, basic, functional gimmick. And that's all there is to it. Moving on to Vanish Fafner. So Vanish Fafner does also have a gimmick being rubber. And when I say the Vanish blade is rubber, I mean that very literally, as these 3 points of plastic are the only plastic parts on the entire blade. Everything else about this blade is just rubber, making it pretty tanky and having, I guess you could say, spin steel, but yeah, they just went all in on the rubber this time. Good way to evolve off of Mirage Fafner, but also it sort of brings back the Geist idea a little bit. Not to the same extent where it has sort of moving parts, but these 3 points right here have kind of holes, which means that they have extra absorption, which is pretty cool. Again, kind of going back to Geist with having the parts that pressed in, so not the same, but at least kind of has that idea there. Beyond that though, it's just a really good kind of tanky Fafnir and ends off the line pretty well. So that works pretty nicely. For Roar Bahamut, we have another really interesting one, as Bahamut sort of had this idea before where it'd sort of shift its blade shape as it lost clicks. This time they went all in on having a rubber lock, which we sort of saw with Gen in GT, but this one, I mean, it just really does go all the way. There's literally no teeth to speak of. It's all just a well, rubber lock. And with that, it sort of changes shape as that moves, with these parts becoming more round, and it's a little more jagged when it has full clicks. So a decent gimmick, and I think the core really does sell it quite well. Savior Valkyrie is probably one of the weirdest bays in all of DB. I'm very glad this wasn't the final Valkyrie, but you have some rubber points in this thing, sort of on the edges of the main wings here, plus these points, which are meant to kind of come off as an awakening gimmick. Beyond that, the core is bound, which just makes the whole layer bound, and that was definitely a choice. Does have a bit of a bursting issue, but you know, beyond that, yeah, it has sort of a bound layer. I guess referencing back to God Valkyrie, that's interesting. So yeah, Savior Valkyrie. Very strange, but kind of interesting. Astral Spriggan is kind of just what you'd expect from a DB Spriggan. It's LR, and like World Spriggan, it is flippable. So you can shift between right and left, which is pretty nice, of course. But also, the Astral Blade does have some extra points of metal, which is pretty cool. Adds a bit of weight, and on the other side, we also have some points of rubber. And if you couldn't tell from sort of the Astral Blade's design, it is very much meant to kind of replicate Legend Spriggan and Spriggan Requiem, which is furthered by having extra metal and rubber. So definitely taking after Beyblade Burst God, which is pretty cool. Although this was not the final Spriggan in DB. However, Guilty Longinus is the final Longinus in DB and just Burst in general. This thing just takes Longinus to an absolute extreme. They went all in on the upper attack idea, and being two-sided does have the 2 armor. I haven't really been mentioning armors much because they don't really need to be mentioned with the gimmicks a lot of time, I don't think, but I guess being kind of a two-sided upper attacker, I feel like makes it a bit more worthwhile to mention. The Longinus core has these 2 dragons, which are metal, making this a very heavy core. And also Guilty, you can just look at this thing. There are 4 metal dragons on this thing, but it gets even crazier, because flipping it over, there are 2 extra dragons. They're mostly plastic, but they still do have a bit of extra metal underneath, and also a side profile of this thing, you get to see this thing has a ridiculous upper attack going for it. It's insane. So Guilty Longinus definitely does prove itself as a great final evolution of Longinus. Nothing crazy here, just really leans into what it was doing before and does it very well. Now we have Savior Perseus. This was sort of our regular re-release of Perseus, as Perseus was originally released as Dynamite Perseus from the Rare Big Get Battle. Kind of, more so just events, but it's technically considered a Rare Big Get Battle, but anyway. It does reuse parts, so the only real thing I note here is the Perseus core itself, which does actually have a bit of a gimmick, in that there is some metal on the inside, kind of see the points there. But it does make it a fairly heavy core, which is helpful, as it sort of gives us a right spin Longinus, kind of. Closest thing we're getting anyway, so nothing else to say about this one, but it does at least give us a pretty good core. We also have Prominence Phoenix, which just has 1 main gimmick, but of course it is based on previous Phoenix bays, and that it has the armor gimmick. Although here it's called the Prominence Shield because, well, armor is kind of a name of a base part in the DB system, so would be a little bit awkward, but anyway. With this, it can sort of just pop off during battle, so that happens, and then this part can go flying around. Cool. Unfortunately, this doesn't work as well as it did in Josette's first up. I wish they maybe added a bit more bulk, maybe even some metal to the shield, but also the way it comes off very much upwards, so it has to clear a bit more plastic before flying off, which is unfortunate. With Revive Phoenix and Dad Phoenix, once it went up a little bit, it could just fly off, but this one has to really go up, meaning it just kind of flies out of the stadium a lot of the time. It's not really that helpful. Obviously, it does work when it does, you know, stay in the stadium, but it doesn't happen quite as much as you might want it to. Beyond that, we saw it in its normal mode, but there's also its heavy mode. So if you rotate it 90 degrees and put it back on, it's now a bit different. This is heavy mode. Basically, this just means it's a lot harder to knock this off during battle. So rather than actually using the Prominence gimmick, you can instead just make this a very thick wall of a blade, which has its own uses, so it's cool. It gave you kind of an option to use it. Again, wish that maybe there's a bit more metal in here or just bulk somewhere else. That could really make the heavy mode stand out as sort of a wall, but as is, it's still a cool idea, and A nice expansion to Phoenix. I just wish that maybe again could have added a little bit on, or at the very least, just make Prominence actually release from the blade a bit easier. Next is Dangerous Belial, another Belial in DB. So with this one, we have rubber points on Dangerous, although they're not really exposed, it's more so reinforcing the plastic to add a bit more weight behind the attacks, which, sure. But the biggest thing about the Dangerous Belial blade is actually the Belial 2 core, and the burst stopper has, so that's fairly noteworthy. And that does sort of make it part of the overdrive system, which the overdrive system, I might do a whole video on subsystems at some point, because I feel like it's an interesting topic. And the overdrive system in particular is very weird, because it's never really clearly defined all that well. If nothing else, maybe I'll do like a short discussion on that, but regardless, it does kind of go back to the Chosi Awakening system. Having a burst stopper in this one is quite effective, so well, that's pretty cool. Definitely a way to buff Belial, as Dynamite Belial didn't have much going on, though you can still use F gear and L gear, as I mentioned, so you can further the rubber contact or lock to high mode to give it more interesting weight distribution and just a bit more weight in general, so this one does have a bit more going on with it. Now we have potentially the weirdest bay in DV with Greatest Raphael. So unfortunately, I can't show the proper gimmick because you have to launch the thing to get the gimmick, and I just do not like to launch my bays. But first up, this is a fully fused DV layer. So it's one single piece, which also means it is locked to high mode permanently. Also part of the overdrive system, which makes sense. I guess you could see like these small little metal tabs on the inside there, which can act as burst stoppers. But beyond that, the main gimmick, you can see kind of these hinges here. This kind of clear part going around here can raise up, and you have two parts that just kind of go upwards, and when spinning, these gold parts sort of make like a halo design and have an extra plastic be kind of high up towards a centralized point. It's very weird, also just a very round bay. Very odd gimmick, one of the weirdest we've ever seen in Beyblade history, honestly. But I do kind of like it anyway. And to finish off DB, not the whole thing because we saw BU, but DB itself, we have Ultimate Valkyrie. Ultimate Valkyrie doesn't really have much going for it in the gimmicks department, which is fine. It's sort of meant to just be a base Valkyrie, a strong attacker with nothing else really going on. It just has these kind of rubber blades on the main part of the Ultimate Blade, which is pretty cool. It can just help to add some more attack, which does help. But beyond these rubber parts helping with attack, that's really all it has going on. I think it makes sense for Valkyrie, but there's not much else to really talk about here. And now we get to Beyblade Burst BU, which just reuses the DB system, but still. And that of course started off with Divine Belial. So Divine Belial is weird because it just has a lot of reused parts. Although Divine does have these 3 points of metal, which helps with attack a bit, I guess, but the most interesting part actually comes from the core, which is weird because at the time it just seemed like a recolor of Belial 2. When in reality it actually had a slight mold difference. So when you look at the core itself, you may notice that there are two small protrusions on sort of the outside parts here. One there, and one there. Very small, but it was a mold difference. These are known as BU locks, with this Belial 2 core having one set of them. BU locks are meant to sort of be these sort of secondary set of teeth almost, and they're meant to be used in conjunction with BU lock discs, and unfortunately there's only two of them, Xanthus and Moon. I really wish they made more, but anyway. It does add another layer of burst resistance, which is pretty cool, and while we didn't see it yet, it would become very important pretty soon here in BU. But it was a fairly sneaky mold change. Beyond that, we would see a lot of different gears release for Divine Belial. Mind you, it could also use the other gears from the perfect gear set, like L gear and F gear, but it got its own set of gears as well. One of which being A gear, which would have two different modes, one of which paired with the actual contact points to make it stronger for attacks, the other one sort of offset it to make it a bit more round, making it more defensive. And the other being H gear, this really weird two-part armor gear. Unlike L gear, could be used in both high mode and low mode. Low mode with the plastic on top, the metal on bottom, as you'd expect. With high mode doing the inverse, and high mode in particular also adding kind of extra burst resistance, which is pretty cool. That way you can still use low mode, but you do get rewarded a bit more for high mode. Although it does use the Belial 2 core, which already has a burst stopper, but whatever, I guess. Interestingly, they also released a Belial 3 core, which just felt kind of random, but yeah, Belial 3. It still had a burst stopper, still had one set of BU locks, just had better teeth and a new design. Sure, I guess. Also, you could argue that this should be the third overdrive bay. Most subsystems have 3 bays in them, and having a burst stopper, you could definitely say Divine Belial is the third overdrive bay, but again, overdrive is just really weird. But we do get another Belial with its own gear set, so that's fairly interesting, I think. Next is Chain Kerbeus, which is actually my favorite bay of all time, but anyway. So the Kerbeus core is effectively just the right version of Bahamut. It has full rubber locks, which is pretty cool, honestly, though it doesn't have the same sort of gimmick that Bahamut does, where unlocking does something. This actually pulls from Tact Longinus, a very awkward GT bay. But it has sort of these chain-like pieces, there's 6 of them, and they kind of just move around, which is pretty cool. And yeah, that can be useful for defense. Also, putting it in high mode will make them all stick out, but using the Kerbeus core in low mode as is makes them just kind of flail around. Not quite as interesting as Tact, but I think it is still really interesting. I like this bay a lot. Doesn't get crazy with gimmicks, but I think Kerbeus is just being kind of a solid defense set, kind of like how Ragnarok is, where slightly evolves its down wings, but remains fairly grounded. I think that's just a good thing for Kerbeus to do, and it pulls it off very, very well. Now, Gatling Dragon actually has a couple different gimmicks. The first one coming from the Dragon core, which is that it is bound. The bound is a bit different than with Valkyries. It doesn't go quite as far and does have a bit of extra tension, meaning its burst resistance isn't terrible. Well, less terrible, I should say. And then the Gatling blade also has a gimmick of sorts. Basically, these parts here can be pressed in. Once those are clicked open, these parts can kind of move around, and with that, it becomes sort of an oval shape. It's kind of based on what Kerbeus Dragon was doing, so I guess that's cool. It's a pretty solid dragon, definitely not measuring up to Imperial Dragon, but I wouldn't expect that, so it's at least a solid entry in the dragon line. And now we have Xiphoid Excalibur. This is when BU locks finally were properly discovered and got proper usage, as this comes with the Xanthus disc. Not really going to get into the Xanthus disc, but it does allow Xiphoid Excalibur, as well as the Belial 2 core, to actually use their BU locks, as the Excalibur core does have one set of BU locks. Beyond that, this bay is sort of straightforward, doesn't have a lot else going on with it. However, when it does get to that second click, there is a sort of metal sword that will pop out, which means that the core is a bit heavier than normal, but also does sort of have a weight shift gimmick to it. So when you have 2 clicks, that sword will pop out. Again, that will help to shift the weight, and the BU lock will help it to kind of stay at this point, which is pretty cool. I really wish they wouldn't have sacrificed the entire design to actually pull this off, but it's at least kind of interesting, so I guess that's cool. Now we have Zest Achilles. Zest Achilles is a really weird bay, because Achilles was always right spin, but now Achilles is dual spin. So yeah, the Achilles core's dual spin also has 2 sets of BU locks, so the first time we ever had multiple sets of BU locks on a single core, which will become a trend. Beyond that, we have the Zest Blade, which just has a bunch of stuff going on with it, and I guess we just take a look at it. So the Zest Blade can be right spin or left spin, depending on which way it's flipped over, which is the same thing we see on Astral. Then you also have these Zest Swords, a sort of add-on to the Zest Blade. So they do go back to just having 1 extra piece for Achilles. I kind of wish they would have 2, make them more specialized maybe, but it's just the 1. Now, you don't have to use it if you don't want to, but I'd recommend doing so. But you can position it, of course, on top, or flipping it over to left, it's now on bottom for left spins. And of course, the same is true on the inverse, where it's now on top for left spins, on bottom for right spins. So basically, if it's on top for either spin direction, that's attack mode, or on bottom is more of a defense mode, which is pretty interesting. So they still do at least have the different roles for this sort of extra piece. So it's not like it's some kind of regression or anything like that. I just wish that maybe they would have kept the 2 pieces and just made them more specialized. But as is, I mean, it still works perfectly fine. Now we have Astral Hello Kitty. This is just an Astral Spriggan reskin. Hello Kitty is LR. Astral is Astral. You got the metal, rubber, flippable blade. Yeah, it's just a reskin of Astral Spriggan. Now we have a really interesting layer with Wind Knight. So Wind Knight, kind of a bay out of left field, but the Knight core has 4 sets of BU locks, which is kind of crazy. However, that's definitely helpful considering the gimmick it does have, which can make it a bit more burst prone, and that is that it is a bound core. But it's a vertical bound core, so basically this thing just moves in very strange ways. It's a strange blade, but yeah. Beyond that, Wind also has a gimmick to it, kind of two. The one that's a bit more questionable is just sort of the size gimmick. It's a very large circle, which we've seen before, and that is sort of the same idea we had with Air Knight, so it does make sense. But now with Wind Knight, you have sort of an airflow gimmick. So by flipping it over, pulling this tab right here, you can sort of shift the thing over a bit, and you put it back, and now you can see it's different. There's no more red, so you can just sort of shift it around. And the idea behind that is basically to make it to where the airflow kind of brings it up a bit, giving it better stamina, or kind of pushing it down to make it more defensive. Considering the size of the Wind Blade, I feel like this actually does work better than you'd expect, and there is at least some difference between modes. So yeah, I really like this blade a lot. Actually, it kind of brings an older idea of kind of airflow, but considering the scale we're at now, actually makes it fairly interesting and more noticeable than one might expect. Really nice bay. And now we're going to cover 2 bays at the same time, Super Hyperion MR and King Helios MR. Each core has 3 sets of BU locks, Hyperion being right, Helios being left, but the main gimmick is of course with the blades and that they can split. It's fairly obvious with the seam here, they split in half, and there's actually 10 different modes. Right now we have Super MR and King MR. MR of course means metal and rubber, as each side has metal and rubber. So you have a bit of extra weight here on each side with the metal, and yeah, these nice rubber contact points as well on the other side, but we can of course mix them around. And we get some interesting combinations like Super King R or Super King M. You can also make Super King MR or Super King RM, which just uses kind of the different parts of the different blades together in either orientation. Also, it's worth noting that both of these blades are actually LR. They're completely unrestricted. They don't have any kind of flip gimmick or anything, but there's unrestricted, so that would make sense with the whole split idea. So with one set, you do get 6 different blades. However, there are actually 10 different versions of these, because if you get 2 sets, you can make Super M, Super R, King M, and King R by pairing the same sides of the same blade together. So having 2 blades will allow you to do that, which is pretty interesting. But the whole idea of fusing them is still really cool. I do think this is probably the most sensible way to evolve these bays. I mean, Super Hyperion and King Helios from Sparking didn't do much of anything, and while we did get Hyperion Burn and Helios Volcano as limit break bays, they could have tried to maybe replicate that to some extent here, which would have been interesting, I guess. Or they could just do something different, and they did something different, pulling from Dual Eclipse with the old split gimmick, and I think it makes sense to do that, because, well, first up, I don't think they were going to give us another Dual Eclipse anyway, but also, these bays were always paired together. It just makes sense that they have sort of a fusion gimmick, so it definitely does work very well. Next is the BU version of Ultimate Valkyrie. This has the same exact layer, same thing we already talked about, just recolored, so not much to say. I just want to make sure it was accounted for. And next is Burst Spriggan. So this is our final Spriggan. It's very similar to Astral Spriggan. You of course have the LR core, although this time it does have BU locks. 3 sets of them, in fact. And on the burst blade, you do have sort of these metal parts as well as the rubber underneath, and also, yeah, it is flippable, having the left spin and right spin modes. Also, while it's apart, probably just mention that there are kind of these extra notches, which do help with burst resistance. But yeah, it does sort of have the whole Legend and Requiem idea yet again. Sort of just a rounder, somewhat expanded upon version of Spriggan Requiem in terms of its layer, so I guess that makes sense for Spriggan. And yeah, it works well enough, I'd say. And finally, we of course have Barricade Lucifer. The Lucifer core has 3 sets of BU locks, and beyond that, Barricade also has a gimmick with these 4 rubber parts here, which do, you know, extend outward during battle. Sort of like how the 2 defense chassis was on Variant Lucifer, although this time, instead of just coming downward and being a massive problem, they just kind of come outward, which still hinders it, kind of, but works a bit better. even if it does hinder it, I still like the gimmick, so that's fine. But yeah, that's really all it has going on, so that's really it. So anyways, that's all for this video for the most part. DB really did perfect gimmicks, I feel. Not everything here is a hit. I have some problems, of course, but nothing's going to be perfect, and I think that they did just put a lot into each and every one of these bays, which is just great to see. I honestly don't know if we'll ever get another line this crazy and in-depth, which is why I miss it a lot, because there's just a lot to talk about here, and it was nice. So I guess we'll have to wait and see, but for now, that's it for this sort of sub-series of videos. Maybe I'll do like a disc or a driver one at some point. I don't know about that, we'll see. But anyways, thanks for watching, and bye-bye.